Hope that's all good. And we are good, I think. If you can't hear me, that is because I'm still messing about with technology. However, in our short time together, I am going to be looking at Dungeons and Dragons and Downpours. And so we're just going to look very briefly at bookending something. And so if you have a Bible, turn to Exodus, and we're going to look at chapter 12. We're going to just look at how the last plague comes. It is the death of the firstborn. And we read, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, so the prince of Egypt, Pharaoh's son, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. And we're going to make a big song and dance about that later. And all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians. There was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he, that is Pharaoh, summons Moses and Aaron by night and said, Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks, take your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And so in our short time this evening, I'm just going to pull a few strands. There will be a sermon coming out later at some point called, what is it called? It's called The Despair of 40 Houses, which is going to look at this kind of idea a little bit more. So do look out for that. But I just want to paint a little bit more of a picture about what I tried to say in that sermon, and also just a very short study for us this evening as we consider Dungeons, Dragons, and Downpours. And to understand where we're going with this, we're going to set the scene of Egypt. And so I want you to remember where Egypt begins, because Egypt begins with Joseph. Egypt begins with Joseph. And Egypt begins with Joseph being sold into slavery. In other words, his brothers, as we read in the story, turn around, they want to kill him, and they're like, do we not? Discussions happen, and he gets thrown into a pit. And for us, we're going to see that the story of Egypt begins with a young man called Joseph who gets a glorious, robe from his father. And his father is a man who, again, is like a king, Jacob. And so we see that there's Joseph, he's got all of his sons, and he turns around and says, Joseph, come here, have my robe, or have this robe. And the first time the word dungeon is mentioned, although we would translate it as pit, is when Joseph is put into a pit. Joseph is put into a pit by his brothers. He's sold off into slavery. And when he gets to Egypt, there he is as a slave, and he gets accused falsely of sleeping with Potiphar's wife. And he gets thrown into another pit. He gets thrown into an Egyptian dungeon. Quite a tough gig. And so we have this weird scene back in Genesis 15, where you have the whole, covenant of the Lord passing through the cut up pieces that Abraham chops up, and then he sees in the night a fiery pot passing through them. And the Lord makes his covenant with Abraham. And he says to Abraham, listen, the cup of iniquity isn't filled for 400 years. Your people, they're going into Egypt. Okay, interesting. Abraham gets some foreshadow into the future. And then from that moment, the very first time that Egypt comes up in the scene involves a pit with Joseph. And after all of the 10 plagues, the 10th plague comes and it ends with a house that's standing, Pharaoh's house. It ends with Pharaoh's house being, contrasted in a way to that of the king who sits on the throne, your son. He will be slayed, even to those captives who are in the dungeon. And so, we sit there and we read that and we go, okay, okay, so anyone's going to get struck down, and yes, that's true, but there's more to it. And the more to it is that the book of Exodus, or sorry, the story of Egypt starts with Joseph as a king figure going into a pit by his own brothers, by the Egyptians, and then Yahweh's hand raising Joseph up out of it. And then you get this time of progression, and then you get the scene of Moses and Aaron and the 10 plagues, and you have Pharaoh's son sitting on a throne, and Pharaoh's son is sitting there ready to take over. But because it is a 40 house, it is a house not built on the rock, it is a house not built on the Lord. The Lord says, I'm going to take this throne and I'm going to put you in the pit. I'm going to, if you will, make your house feel like a dungeon. And basically, for everyone today who doesn't want to build their house on the Lord, the same thing applies. So we have this scene of dungeons and this idea of pits. And as we work our way through this, within the whole of the 10 plagues, within all of your, Old Testament, New Testament, even today, there is a figure who is always lying, always bending the truth, always saying there's a quick fix, an easy way. And we know that Jesus turns around and says, the serpent, the devil, Satan, the dragon, is a murderer and a liar and has been since the beginning. And we see that in John 8. And you go, is there anything redeemable then about this scaly creature? And Jesus is like, no, no. And we see throughout the whole of the Bible, there's always these whispers, these echoes of quick fixes, and these echoes and these whispers of there's a better way. You don't have to do this. You don't have to do that. And as we know, how does Jesus know what good is? Because he only does what good is. How does he know what evil is? Because he only does what good is. If you only do what's good, you know the opposite. How does he know what good is? As he says, I only do what I see the Father revealing. I only do what the Father tells me to do. What does the Father tell him to do? Good. And so we have this contrast of house building. And throughout the narrative of Egypt, and throughout this concept of dungeons and this idea of bookends to the whole Egypt narrative of Joseph, pit, and then redemption coming out of Egypt, ending in a dungeon scene before the Israelites are released, there's always whispers. And the funny thing is that back in Exodus 12:12, in your Bibles, Yahweh turns around and says something quite weird. He turns around and he says, I'm going to pass through the land of Egypt, and I'm going to strike all the firstborn in the land, both man and beast. And we go, okay, okay, that's intense enough. And then he says, and then I'm also going to execute judgment on the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. And if we were to think about the first commandment, you shall have no other gods, no other God but me. There shall be no other God but me. It's a weird commandment. If you were to think about it, it is a strange commandment. You will have no other God but me. And you go, there is only one God. And it's almost going, yeah, I am the only God. I'm it. I'm the one who's sovereign. I'm the one who's powerful. But there's beings that have forced wisdom, spirits that kind of will say things and whisper things, tell you untruths, and you're going to listen to it if you're not careful, if you don't protect and keep my word, if you don't think about what I've said. And that's exactly what you see in the Garden of Eden. Adam, protect everything in the garden, keep it, guard it. And you see a serpent turn up, starts whispering things, shortcuts, and we know the story. And one of the great whispers that the ancient dragon can whisper into our hearts and into our lives, the obvious one is clear, is that you can build a 40 house and it will stand. And we see in the 10th plague that the Lord's like, no, that's not going to happen. But there's another lie that can be whispered. And it's the lie that actually nothing you do, nothing you say in your life, the Lord's not overseeing. And if you were to think about Joseph, and if you were to think about where his life started, if you were to think about the fact that there is this young man, he's got his brothers, his father clothes him with a robe of glory, and then he spends what would seem like a lifetime in dungeons, in pits. His brothers put him into a pit. The Egyptians put him into a pit. And again, this word pit is interchangeable with the word dungeon in the Hebrew. So he goes and he's left. He's left by his brothers to die. He's left by the Egyptians to die. That his brothers sell him off. The Egyptians leave him. It's only when the cupbearer remembers him, and he's like, oh, there's a guy who can interpret dreams. Oh, his name's Joseph. And you see that out of these pits, Yahweh raised him up. The Lord raised him up. The Lord raised him. The Lord sat him as, if you will, the right-hand man of Pharaoh, who went on to save the known world. Joseph was the man. And so the ancient dragon can whisper into your heart and into mine all sorts of lies. And one of them is that God doesn't care and doesn't care for you. He's not interested in your life. The pain you're going through, the suffering you're going through, he's not interested. And it's a lie. It's a great lie. And so we see this theme of dungeons, we see here this idea of dragons, and very briefly for us, we see this idea of downpours. You see that Pharaoh, in verse 30 of the text, turns around and is weeping. The Lord passes through, strikes down the firstborn, and a great cry is heard in Egypt. There's anguish in the heart, there's pain, there's suffering, sorrow. And we see that actually Pharaoh is weeping for the first time. It took all these plagues to get a heart response. And it's too late because we know the rest of the story. Pharaoh's anger embitters him, his hatred embitters him, and he goes off chasing after the Israelites to wash their house away. The irony is that actually it's his house, his dynasty, that gets washed away. It is the house of Egypt that gets removed as it passes through the Red Sea. And it is the Israelites who go through and, if you will, are baptized into Yahweh. They are saved, they are rescued. They're being birthed into something new. But a great cry of anguish was heard in Egypt. They'd listened to 40 dragons. They'd listened to their gods. They'd listened to those saying it will be okay. The temple worshippers could mimic the first two plagues, and after that, there was nothing. And the great challenge for you and I is, how are we going to cry? How are we going to weep? One way or another, there will be an outpour from us. There will be a downpour of our tears. It will either be in bitterness and pain. It will either be with gnashing of teeth and anger, or it will be like those who we see in the Gospels who are rejoicing because they know that they've been saved. They know that they've been washed and cleansed. And so just a few thoughts for you tonight to think about. I hope God blesses you and keeps you. And just to close, because it's always good to include a psalm, and as you've endured for so long, I would help if I found it. Let me just read these 3 verses from Psalm 40. A man who knew about dungeons, about pits, about despair, about dragons, and about Yahweh's mighty hand. King David, Psalm of David, reads, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to hear my cry. He drew me up from the dungeon of destruction, from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog. He set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear. Many will put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. And so may your life and my life be built upon the rock. And when we're in times of need, may we not cry out and listen to dragons asking him for help, but may we cry out to the Lord. May we cry out to the one who saves, and may his hand lift us out of the daily dungeons we find ourselves. God bless everyone. Bye for now.